Well, first of all, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming along this morning. I'm sorry we didn't get at least one member of the press, but lots of them have had a copy, and I hope that... well, we did get one mention actually on Saturday in Mesa Hall. The political editor of the Express, Daily Express, actually gave us a mention, and I know the BBC have got it and are interested, I believe. But as I'll say as we go along, this is something that's going to become of more importance and prominence. Let me say some thanks first of all. Thank you for all coming, as I said. I'd like to thank the Parliament, although they're not here. They actually, Parliament Office allowed us to use this building. Very grateful to them for giving us the room. And of course, I've always found over the last 10 years that dealing with the administrators of the Parliament and the bureaucrats, they've always done a professional job. They've always been very helpful, and I have no complaints about them, I'm glad to say. I'd like to thank Rupert Matthews of Bretwalda for actually publishing the book and my other two books, because writing books is one thing, getting them published is quite another, and they do a fantastic range of titles on political and historical subjects, and they've got one of their prolific authors over there, Dr. Lee Rotherham, who's got about at least 3 out that I know of at the moment, maybe more. And his latest one is on the, it's a tourist guide to pre-revolution America, isn't it? Because I picked up a copy the other night. So look at their book list, there's a fascinating range of subjects there. And of course I'd really like to special thanks to Pavel Stroilov, who's my collaborator and researcher on this book. And it's due to Pavel's fantastic research that we've actually uncovered so many facts that we've been able to put in this current publication. And of course to Tim for endorsing the book and the message in the book, because he is obviously a very prestigious voice to have on our side of the argument of what is going to be a big debate and discussion. I think it's true to say that we have actually won the argument on getting out of the European Union and making the case that Britain would be better off out. Even public opinion polls now show a majority of people think we would be better off out. And that is despite having the establishment, the media and political elite, the BBC, big business, the President of the United States, all telling us that we can't live outside the European Union. Still people, a majority of people, despite all that, and despite what has been the lone voice of UKIP over the last 20 years, promoting the message of withdrawal, they actually get the message. And I think it will be small things that will bring it home. When you go into your shop to buy a vacuum cleaner and you realise that the British government is powerless to actually set the voltage, the maximum amount of voltage allowed in a vacuum cleaner, then you realise they probably haven't got much control of anything else either. And it will be small things like that that actually bring it home to the general public, as it is increasingly happening. So having won the EU out argument, the next big debate in the years going forward is going to be, okay, then how do we get out of the European Union? Now, in fact, a number of books have been published on this already, and let me mention 3 so far, which are relevant. First of all, there was the Institute of Economic Affairs Brexit Prize. Do you remember that? In which they invited submissions for an exit plan. And the prize winner of that was Ian Mansfield, earlier on in the year. There's another book come out by my erstwhile colleague David Campbell-Bannerman called Time to Jump. And there is a third one that landed on my desk recently from Civitas, the think tank, called Softening the Blow by Jonathan Linsell. Now, all of these books have got something in common. In fact, as far as I know, everything that's been published on this so far has got something in common, which is that they all take the route prescribed by the European Union, which is Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty, which I'll be saying a bit more about. Now, all of these books contain a wish list of the unlikely at best and the unachievable at worst in what they think they're going to get from the European Union in these protracted negotiations to actually leave. And I don't think that it's ever going to happen. The main thing that's never going to happen is open borders. They all recognise that open borders is a bad thing. They all want to limit it to a greater or lesser extent, but it is central to what the European Union is about. Ever since this fellow set it up, I can't remember the quote, but the words in effect were, we can only achieve our aims by doing it surreptitiously by deceit. He knew very well that the European Union that they were setting up all those years ago, before the Second World War this was planned, and moved into earnest after the Second World War, could not be achieved if you actually told people what you were going to do, because they knew very well that ordinary people wouldn't actually want it. And what it's about is creating a single political borderless state. You can't have a state and bad borders, internal borders. Well, you could have in the Soviet Union, I suppose, you have a passport to travel down. That's an extreme example. But most countries do not have internal borders. So the one thing that the European Union is never going to sacrifice is control on open borders. And all of these studies, as I said, recognise its importance, and they are never going to get it, and it's never going to happen. Now, these studies, of course, have all been published in response to David Cameron's phony referendum promise. And what did he promise? Well, of course, the pressure's been kept up by UKIP over the years, as I said, but only in recent years have they really come to realise the electoral threat that we are, and they have to deal with it. So how did they deal with it? Well, David Cameron, how has he dealt with it? He's actually made this phony referendum promise. And what has he actually promised? What he said is, vote Tory so that we can form the next government. And when we've done that, we will go away and renegotiate our terms of membership of the European Union. But he hasn't said what it is he wants to renegotiate. Nobody knows, including himself, I'm sure. But never mind, he's going to go away and renegotiate. He's going to come back with his renegotiated terms, and whatever they are, he's going to ask you and the general public to vote for it, so that we can all vote yes to stay inside the European Union in whatever way it's been renegotiated in 2017, when the great referendum is promised. And of course, those of you, not many here I can see, are old enough to remember Harold Wilson in 1975. Unfortunately, I am. And of course, it's exactly what Harold Wilson did, and I voted Labour in 1974 precisely for one and only time we voted Labour was to get a referendum. And Harold Wilson went off, he renegotiated the terms, he came back with about 8 points, I think, which nobody can remember, and I remember 2 of those points, which is one was a reform of the Common Agricultural Policy, which they're still talking about 40 years later, and a commitment not to enter into monetary union, which we're still arguing about 40 years later, and the rest of them were so inconsequential that nobody can remember what they were anyway. I haven't met a historian who can actually run them off the top of his head, but never mind. That's what Harold Wilson did, recommended that we all vote for it, 2/3 of the British people did, and here we are, where we are today, 40 years later, where we control practically no areas of domestic policy anymore, because they've all been transferred to the European Union. Now, just suppose that there is a referendum. I'm dubious about whether it'll ever happen, but just suppose there is. And despite the efforts of the BBC, the media, big business, the President of the United States no doubt will find something to say again, and all of these people will say, you can't possibly survive outside of the European Union, don't do it, don't do it. And the British people still vote by a majority to leave. So what are we going to actually get under Article 50? And of course, those of you not familiar with Article 50, this is the mechanism supposedly whereby you leave. I point out in the book that it's actually a mechanism to prevent countries leaving rather than to enable it, but we'll go into that in a minute. So what will we actually get? You will get Dave, if Dave is still in power of course, Dave of the effing Tories will go off to Brussels and renegotiate the terms, and there will be 2 years of political chaos. Because every time that there's a discussion about something, you bet your life it will be leaked. The BBC and the establishment and the media and everybody else will be pulling it apart and picking holes in it. And this is going to go on for a minimum of 2 years. And how is a Prime Minister going to hold his nerve for that 2-year period in the lead up to the day when he actually has to take this out, being sniped at and bombarded continually by all the vested interests that actually want to keep us in? Especially a Prime Minister that doesn't actually want to leave in the first place. It's never going to happen. It's a fantasy. And of course, under Article 50, this leaving period, this negotiation period can be protracted indefinitely. And who knows who's going to be the next Prime Minister who'll then come along and say, oh, sorry, we can't do it, and then forget the referendum. Don't forget, referendums are not legally binding. And Parliament cannot be held to any decision that's made anyway. Now, as I said, Article 50 is a mechanism to actually prevent countries leaving the European Union, not to enable it. And what my book explains, it explains how Article 50 is a trap. It explains how we can leave unilaterally under English law, how we can leave unilaterally under international law, and then it again explains and lays out a plan for the practical means of actually leaving the European Union. And the big problem, of course, is how do we deal with this vast accumulated body of law, the acquis communautaire, which we've signed up to over the last 40 years, which I think now amounts to what? 25,000 pieces of legislation, 150,000 pages of words. I've no idea, I'm not sure anybody actually knows the vast amount of all this legislation which controls now every aspect of our lives. So, the plan. Let me say something in slight detail, not too much detail because you can read the book. You'll all get a free one today as a reward for actually turning out. But Article 50 says you can leave. There's this 2-year negotiating period. As I said, it can actually be extended indefinitely between the parties, the government and the European Council actually negotiating it. What few people realise also is that we go as a supplicant. This is like joining the EU, only in reverse. A country applies to join. The terms of their joining are worked out by the European Council, and then they're offered a package. And of course, the same thing applies in reverse. We go as a supplement saying, oh, please sir, we'd like to leave. And we tell them what we like, and they go off and have discussions which we are not allowed to be part of. They come up with a package which will then be decided on qualified majority voting, which we won't vote in because obviously we can't, because we are the supplicant nation. And then eventually, at some point, they'll give us a deal whereby we can leave, which of course you can bet your life will involve the payment of a great deal of money. And of course, what will we actually sign up to in terms of open borders, what law is going to apply, and I'll say something about that in a second. But under English law, there is nothing to stop us leaving the European Union whenever we feel like it, because treaties are not law. Treaties are contracts between governments, and we all know that history is littered with discarded and torn up treaties. The only part of a treaty which becomes law, which is one which is expressly transposed into an Act of Parliament. And of course, any Act of Parliament that has been passed by Parliament can be repealed or replaced by another Act of Parliament. Parliament, at least in theory, is sovereign and can do, more or less, within the common law, what it likes. And it can certainly repeal the 1972 European Communities Act. Under international law, again, under the Vienna Convention on Treaties, no treaty can override a fundamental constitutional principle of a country. Therefore, if we say, as I argue in my first book, that our membership of the European Union was actually unlawful in the first place and did override principles of our law, we can discard it, no problem at all. And then, of course, there are things which determine self-determination for nations and peoples under the Atlantic Charter, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. There's no problem in doing this. And of course there are lots of precedents in history for countries who declared unilateral independence, the most obvious one of course being the United States of America in 1776. So we can go back to the President of the United States when he tells us we ought to be members of the EU. Well, they've done it already. And of course, as Pavel's brilliant research has highlighted in the book, all of the Soviet socialist republics of the old USSR after 1990 left. And they too had elaborate Article 50 type arrangements whereby they were supposed to apply and go through long periods. And of course, they all got out in days and weeks, not in years. They said, thank you very much, goodbye, and they left. Now, one thing I'd like to mention is that none of these other books, and none commentator that I've seen so far, has picked up this other thing called vested rights. Now, vested rights is founded on the concept of EU citizenship and something called legal heritage. Now, if we left, even under David Cameron's plan, under Article 50, we would also be obligated to observe the vested legal rights of people who've already come here. So we've had millions of people come here as migrants over the last few years. Now, I'm not suggesting, for one thing, I'm no longer the spokesman on immigration for UKIP, but obviously, what do you do with all the millions of people who've come here from different countries, from the EU? You're not going to just kick them out. You'd have to have a plan. But people who are here, who are not British citizens, have to have a legal basis for being here. You can't just turn up in another country and expect to live there. being part of that one big country. On what basis are you here? Well, my plan was, if you're working, you're paying tax, you've got commitments like mortgages and family, you're not a lawbreaker, you're not a criminal, then we give you permanent leave to remain, or a work permit, and later on you can apply for citizenship. What do you do with the people who sleep outside my house drinking cans of lager, the beggars, the thieves, and the criminals that have come over in vast numbers? You say, thank you very much, you're not contributing to our economy, we're not going to give you leave to remain, and you can leave. Please go on the next, But you can't do that under Article 50 because you will have to agree that these people have their vested legal rights and they can stay. It's also possible that anybody who was born up until the time that we actually leave would also have these vested legal rights. It's a bit of a grey area, but also who's going to be making the decisions on this? It won't be British courts and our Supreme Court. It will be the European Court of Justice and the European Court of Human Rights. Can you imagine the years of legal wrangling? Look how much money now is wasted because of people's applications to the European Court of Human Rights and our own under the Human Rights Act. You will have years and years and billions of cost why people take this to the courts and claim that we can't actually do what we want to do in our own sovereign country. And this is going to be another big issue as we go forward, and people actually have to answer how they would get out under Article 50. Hopefully some press will pick this up in the years to come. They're going to have to ask the politicians who are proposing this, how are they going to deal with this? And tell me why, as an ordinary British person, you would vote for a government that's going to take you out of the EU and leave you with something that actually doesn't look like you're out of the EU anyway. Because what they're proposing, and we're all told it's a wonderful thing, is in the Norway and Switzerland model. But when you look at it closely, it isn't so great, because Norway and Switzerland still get saddled with about 25% of EU law. Okay, they're better off than we are, but they're still not in a free place. They're still not an independent country. They still have to observe lots of the law. And most importantly, they have to observe open borders. They have to have open borders with the rest of the EU. And surely if there's one single issue that has infuriated the British public over the last few years and the ordinary voter, it is the open borders policy, which is demonstrably unfair and chaotic and undesirable. But we don't end up with that. We wouldn't end up outside of the European Union under a Norway or Switzerland model. We would just end up as a kind of peripheral country under what we highlight in the book as concentric circles of the EU, where you're not a full member, but you're on the edge, and you're like one of the vassal states of the old Roman Empire, where they didn't actually occupy you, but you paid your tribute and you did what you told, otherwise they sent the legion in. So what's the exit plan for actually getting out? Well, I'll very, very briefly, this is itemised in the book. We repealed the 1972 European Communities Act. We stopped all payments to the budget. We say thank you very much, we're not actually members anymore. All of the EU law which has been transposed, all the directives which have been transposed into acts of parliament would of course stay. There wouldn't be chaos because those laws would still be in place. I would suggest then that Parliament sets up a commission to actually repeal or amend those laws going forward. It might take a couple of years, it might take longer, in which we then say, well, this bit, okay, we need that part of this bit, we're going to get rid of the rest, we'll pass a new law. And of course, trade would not suffer at all, because as we all know, they sell us far more than we sell them. No country in history has ever stopped trading with a country where they're actually making a profit. And our profitable trade is actually with the US and the rest of the world. It isn't with the EU, and I'm sure to back this up. We have a massive trade deficit with the EU. They are not going to stop trading with us because they're upset with us for leaving their little club, the European Union. So there's been no loss of jobs, as anyone who understands this will tell you, because although 3 million jobs may be linked to trade with the EU, there's millions of more jobs in the EU which are linked with trade with the UK. No loss of trade, no loss of jobs. And of course we would be in a position, a strong position, to actually negotiate a trade agreement with the EU because we'd be in a very secure and strong position outside. And any trade deal has to be a consequence of leaving, not a condition of leaving. So that's why my book is all about how we can unilaterally and unconditionally withdraw from the EU, and indeed that is going to be the only way that we are ever going to get out and be a fully independent.